Judge Naomi Carter was respected for her fairness in the courtroom. Sergeant Mark Halstead was feared for his arrogance on the streets. When their paths collided during a single traffic stop, it sparked a shocking scandal that exposed abuse of power, racial prejudice, and led to a $30 million lawsuit that rocked the entire city. Welcome to Narrated Mysteries, uncovering lies, betrayal, and the chilling stories people tried to bury. The city of Brookhaven was known for its quiet mornings. Streets usually carried the hum of cars heading to work, the soft chatter of pedestrians, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from corner cafes. On one of those mornings, Judge Naomi Carter followed her usual routine. She was a woman of discipline, respected not just for her position, but for her steady commitment to fairness. To her, mornings were moments of clarity before the weight of legal disputes and courtroom decisions filled her day. Driving toward the courthouse, she replayed in her mind the cases waiting on her docket, each one carrying consequences that could change lives. Naomi's life had not been free of challenges. As one of the few black judges in the state, she had faced prejudice, subtle dismissals, and moments where her authority was questioned simply because of her identity. But she had carved her path with persistence, earning a reputation as someone who could not be intimidated. Behind her calm expression rested years of battles fought quietly, victories earned without spectacle, and a career built on dignity. That morning, the sun reflected off the windshield of her black sedan as she drove steadily through the neighborhoods she had lived in for most of her adult life. To her, these streets were familiar, safe, and predictable. She had no reason to expect trouble. There was nothing unusual in the air, nothing that hinted at the storm waiting only a few miles ahead. What Naomi could not see was that someone else was beginning his day very differently. Sergeant Mark Halstead, stationed nearby, was scanning traffic with a different mindset. Known among his peers for his sharp temper and inflated ego, he had already set his eyes on an opportunity to assert control. Their paths were about to cross, and from that moment on, the city of Brookhaven would never be the same. Flashing lights appeared suddenly in Naomi Carter's rearview mirror, breaking the calm rhythm of her morning. She slowed her car and pulled over to the side of the road, her hands steady on the wheel. Traffic stops were not unusual, and as a judge, she had seen countless cases where drivers faced routine checks. Still, a faint unease flickered through her mind. She had not been speeding, and her documents were always in order. Yet something about the aggressive way the patrol car closed in on her set her on edge. Sergeant Mark Halstead stepped out of his cruiser with deliberate force in his stride. His reputation among locals was complicated. To some, he was an officer who never hesitated to flex authority. To others, he was a bully in uniform, hiding behind a badge. This morning, his body language carried more than the formality of duty. His jaw was clenched, his expression sharp, as though he had already judged the driver before reaching the car window. Naomi lowered her window, calm and patient, waiting for the standard request for license and registration. Instead, Halstead loomed close, his tone clipped and accusing. He claimed she had been driving over the speed limit, though her dashboard had shown otherwise. His eyes flicked to the judicial permit on her dash, narrowing with something more than suspicion. What might have been an ordinary stop was already straying into something different, something heavier. Passing drivers began to slow, curious about the scene. A simple exchange between officer and citizen was escalating into a performance, fueled by Halstead's determination to dominate the moment. Naomi, still seated, could sense the shift. What should have been a brief stop on a quiet road was turning into the beginning of a confrontation that would spiral far beyond that morning. Naomi Carter sat upright in her seat, her composure unshaken even as the tone of the traffic stop grew sharper. Sergeant Halstead's questions came rapid and accusatory, each one carrying an undercurrent of hostility rather than concern for safety. He demanded explanations for her route, implied that her license plate looked unusual, and spoke with the kind of confidence that suggested he was less interested in facts and more intent on exerting control. His posture leaned forward, chest puffed, eyes narrowed, as though he were confronting a suspect rather than addressing a respected member of the judiciary. The shift was clear to anyone who might have been watching. This was not procedure. The calm professionalism expected of an officer was replaced by a performance of intimidation. Naomi knew the signs well. She had seen them in countless testimonies and complaints that passed through her courtroom. Now, she was living it herself. Each word from Halstead felt less like a lawful inquiry and more like a deliberate attempt to provoke. Inside, she reminded herself to remain steady. She answered his questions clearly, her voice even, her hands visible at all times. Still, it did not seem to matter. Halstead's suspicions grew louder, his tone dripping with disdain as he glanced again at the judicial permit displayed openly on her dashboard. Instead of respecting it, he seemed irritated by its presence, as if the sight of authority equal to or greater than his own was a personal challenge. Naomi could feel the tension thickening in the air. A simple traffic check had twisted into something charged with resentment and bias. What might have ended with a warning or a citation was evolving into a confrontation, and Halstead, driven by entitlement, appeared determined to push it further. Sergeant Halstead's voice grew sharper as he stepped back from the window and ordered Naomi Carter to exit her vehicle. His command carried no explanation, no calm assurance, only the heavy weight of authority delivered like a threat. Naomi, knowing the dangers of escalation, unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out quietly. The morning air felt different now, thick, tense, charged with the eyes of strangers beginning to gather at a distance. Her movements were steady, deliberate, every action measured to avoid giving him an excuse. Yet the officer's demeanor only hardened. Standing tall beside his cruiser, he spoke loudly, ensuring anyone nearby could hear his accusations. He framed her calmness as arrogance, her silence as defiance, and when his gaze fell once more on the permit in her car, he twisted it into evidence of privilege. The words he chose stung, carrying undertones that revealed more than professional duty. They revealed resentment. Passers-by slowed their steps, some lifting their phones to record. They saw a judge being treated like a suspect, a black woman being forced to the side of the road without cause. The spectacle fed Halstead's behavior. Instead of following procedure, he carried himself like a performer on a stage, his entitled remarks echoing across the pavement. Naomi stood still, her dignity intact, refusing to let his hostility break her composure. But inside, she recognized the danger of his mindset. This was no longer about a traffic violation. It was about power. Halstead's words, mocking her title, sneering at her authority, made it clear he was determined to remind her of his control in that moment. What began as an ordinary stop had transformed into a public display of humiliation, and with each passing second, the line between duty and harassment blurred beyond recognition. The tension deepened as Halstead escalated further. Without warning, he announced he would conduct a search. Naomi Carter knew she had given no reason for suspicion, yet arguing on the roadside risked turning a dangerous situation into something far worse. She allowed the process to unfold, but what followed was far from routine. In full view of the gathering bystanders, Halstead ordered her to stand with her arms apart as he patted her down. The search was excessive, invasive, and humiliating. It was not the careful procedure of a professional officer. It was a display meant to degrade. His hands moved with unnecessary force, each action laced with an unspoken challenge. The public silence was broken only by the faint gasps of onlookers who understood they were witnessing something wrong. Cell phones rose higher, recording every detail as evidence of misconduct. Naomi held her ground, her face calm, her movements steady, refusing to let his actions strip her of her dignity. But the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. She was not only a black woman being harassed on the roadside. She was a judge, sworn to uphold the very laws now being twisted against her. The bitter irony burned, but she remained unshaken. Halstead, however, seemed energized by the attention. His voice grew louder, his accusations sharper, as though each new word reinforced his image of dominance. He treated the presence of cameras not as a warning, but as an opportunity to showcase authority unchecked. What should have been a private, professional interaction had become a public spectacle. The humiliation was undeniable, the abuse of power unmistakable. And though Naomi stayed composed, the crowd's growing outrage made it clear. The officer's entitlement had crossed into something dangerous that could not be ignored. When Halstead finally returned to his cruiser to run Naomi Carter's information, the atmosphere seemed to pause. The onlookers waited, some whispering among themselves, others keeping their phones trained on the scene. Naomi stood still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her composure steady despite the public humiliation. She knew what the officer would soon discover, and a quiet certainty rested beneath her calm expression. Moments later, Halstead stepped out again, holding the results of his search. The realization was written across his face. He had not been detaining an ordinary citizen. He had been harassing a sitting judge with decades of service. The weight of her title and reputation should have curbed his behavior immediately, but instead it seemed to harden his resolve. The entitlement that had guided his actions from the start now twisted into something even more dangerous. Rather than de-escalate, Halstead doubled down. His words became harsher, dripping with disdain as he accused her of using her position to evade accountability. He spoke loudly enough for the crowd to hear, framing her identity as a shield rather than the truth of her profession. The badge on his chest became a weapon, not of law, but of ego. For Naomi, the insult was twofold. Not only was she being degraded as a black woman, but also as a public servant who had given her life to upholding justice. The officer's behavior revealed itself for what it truly was, an abuse of authority rooted in prejudice and arrogance. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, disbelief turning to anger. Phones captured every word, every gesture, preserving the evidence that would soon ignite national outrage. Halstead thought he was asserting control, but in reality, he was sealing his own downfall with every careless action. That evening, the incident that had unfolded on the roadside no longer belonged only to the witnesses who had stood there in shock. Videos from the scene began appearing online, first shared by those who had recorded it and then rapidly reposted across platforms. Within hours, the footage spread beyond Brookhaven, traveling through news feeds and trending hashtags until millions had seen it. What the world watched was not just a traffic stop. It was the public humiliation of a respected judge at the hands of a uniformed officer who carried himself with unchecked arrogance. The recording showed everything clearly. It captured Halstead's tone, his body language, and the unnecessary search that had left Judge Carter exposed before strangers. The internet dissected every second, frame by frame. Users pointed out the hostility in his words, the smirk on his face, and the restraint in Naomi's composure. Outrage poured in from every corner. To some, it was yet another example of systemic injustice. To others, it was proof of how authority could be abused in broad daylight without fear consequences. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Anchors played the clip on repeat, each network offering commentary on the behavior of the officer and the calm dignity of the judge. Activists called for immediate suspension, while legal experts warned that the city faced serious repercussions. In Brookhaven, the police department tried to control the damage with a brief statement about an internal review, but the public was not satisfied. By nightfall, the video had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just evidence of misconduct, it was a rallying point. The world had seen the abuse, and silence was no longer an option. A storm of accountability was gathering, and it would not be ignored. As the video continued to circulate, the city of Brookhaven felt the weight of a growing crisis. Protests began outside the courthouse, with citizens carrying signs demanding justice and accountability. Local leaders who once spoke cautiously about law enforcement now called for immediate action, their voices amplified by the outrage flooding through social media. Every hour brought new pressure, and the police department's silence only deepened the anger. Inside the department, officials scrambled to contain the damage. Their statement about an internal review sounded hollow against the clarity of the footage. People did not need a review. They had already seen what happened with their own eyes. Calls for Halstead's suspension became louder, but days passed without decisive action. To many, it looked like the city was protecting him, just as they had in the past. Judge Carter, meanwhile, made her move quietly but firmly. She filed a formal complaint, outlining the harassment, the unlawful search, and the abuse of authority she endured. Her decision was not just about her own dignity. It was about exposing a culture that allowed misconduct to thrive unchecked. Her actions carried weight, not only because of her position, but because she had lived the humiliation in front of the public. The filing of her complaint drew immediate attention from national media. Headlines framed the case as a battle between entitlement and justice, power and accountability. Editorials demanded change, and interviews with legal analysts painted a bleak picture for the city if it failed to act. Brookhaven's leaders now stood at a crossroads. They could discipline one officer and attempt to move forward, or they could face something far greater. The decision was slipping out of their hands. However, because Naomi Carter's next step would ensure the matter could no longer be quietly buried. Weeks after filing her complaint, Judge Naomi Carter took the next decisive step. Her legal team announced a $30 million lawsuit against the city of Brookhaven and its police department. The numbers alone drew headlines, but the claims behind them carried even greater weight. The lawsuit alleged harassment, racial discrimination, and abuse of power, detailing how an officer's unchecked arrogance had not only humiliated a sitting judge, but also undermined the trust between law enforcement and the community. The announcement sent shockwaves through the city. Reporters filled the courthouse steps, eager to capture every detail. Community leaders praised Carter's courage, calling the lawsuit a necessary strike against a system that too often allowed misconduct to fade into silence. For many residents, it became more than a legal action. It became a symbol of resistance, a demand that justice apply equally to those who wear the badge. City officials reacted with visible unease. Behind closed doors, discussions focused on damage control, financial risk, and the fear of national scrutiny. Publicly, they insisted the case would be handled fairly, but skepticism ran high. The footage, the outrage, and now the lawsuit had created a storm too powerful to dismiss with press releases. Halstead himself remained defiant, reportedly telling colleagues that he had done nothing wrong. Yet as the lawsuit gained traction, whispers about his past began to circulate more openly. His history of complaints, once buried in departmental files, was suddenly relevant again. What had been ignored before now loomed over the city like a shadow. Naomi Carter's lawsuit was not only a demand for compensation. It was a challenge to the very structure that had enabled officers like Halstead to act with impunity. And with the world watching, the city could no longer hide what lay beneath the surface. As the lawsuit moved forward, the process of discovery peeled back layers the city had long kept hidden. Court filings forced the release of internal records, and what they revealed shocked even those who expected corruption. Sergeant Halstead's name appeared repeatedly in citizen complaints, stretching back over a decade. Many of the reports shared a troubling pattern: accusations of harassment, excessive force, and discriminatory behavior, most lodged by minorities who felt powerless to fight back. Time and again, the complaints have been dismissed. Some are labeled unsubstantiated, others quietly buried under paperwork. A few had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements, silencing victims in exchange for small payouts. Together, they painted a picture not of isolated mistakes, but of a system that had chosen protection over accountability. The revelations became public almost immediately. Journalists pored over the documents, connecting the dots and highlighting how Halstead's actions on the roadside with Judge Carter were not a shocking anomaly, but the culmination of years of unchecked misconduct. Editorials condemned the leadership of the police department for enabling such behavior. The community, already angered by the viral video, now had proof of institutional negligence. Inside the courtroom, Carter's attorneys built their case meticulously, showing how the city had ignored warning after warning. Each ignored complaint became evidence not only against Halstead, but against the department itself. The argument was simple yet devastating. This was not one officer's arrogance, but a culture of entitlement allowed to thrive. For the city of Brookhaven, the scandal was no longer about one traffic stop. It was about years of silence, years of victims dismissed, and years of misconduct tolerated. The trial was exposing far more than the actions of a single officer. It was uncovering the rot within the system meant to protect. As the evidence piled higher, the walls around Sergeant Halstead began to close in. The same colleagues who once defended him in hushed tones now kept their distance. His reputation, once built on bravado within the department, was collapsing under the weight of public exposure. Internal emails leaked to reporters showed that senior officials had long known about his history, but chose to shield him, fearing the backlash of admitting fault. Those messages revealed coordinated efforts to downplay citizen complaints, redirect blame, and protect Halstead from discipline. The leaks devastated the department's credibility. Officers who had once worked alongside Halstead now faced questions from their own families and neighbors. Morale sank as the community turned its anger not just on Halstead, but on the uniform itself. For many inside the force, distancing from him became a way of self-preservation. He was no longer a peer. They began to treat him as a liability. In the courtroom, the shift was unmistakable. Witnesses who had once hesitated came forward, emboldened by the momentum of the trial. Former officers testified about a culture of silence, describing how complaints were brushed aside or buried to protect the department's image. Their words painted a picture of an institution more invested in shielding itself than in protecting the public. Halstead, once brash and confident, grew visibly strained as the proceedings wore on. His defiance seemed hollow against the mountain of evidence and the abandonment of those he counted as allies. Each new revelation isolated him further, stripping away the image of authority he had clung to for years. The trial had shifted from a question of one officer's misconduct to a reckoning for the entire city. And as the pressure mounted, it became clear that the final outcome would reach far beyond Halstead's career. When the jury finally delivered its verdict, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The decision was unanimous. Judge Naomi Carter had proven her case. The city of Brookhaven was ordered to pay the full $30 million in damages. The number carried weight, but it was the symbolism behind it that truly shook the nation. The judgment was not only about compensation. It was a public acknowledgement that authority had been abused and dignity had been stripped away under the watch of those sworn to uphold the law. The fallout was immediate. Halstead was terminated from the force, stripped of his badge and pension. His career, once bolstered by arrogance, ended in disgrace. The police department's leadership was forced into sweeping reforms. Training programs on bias and accountability were rolled out, oversight committees were established, and new systems for handling citizen complaints were implemented under public scrutiny. For many residents, it felt like long overdue change. Judge Carter, though vindicated, carried the scars of the ordeal. Her decision to pursue justice had not been about money, but about principle. She had stood against humiliation, against prejudice, and against the machinery that allowed misconduct to thrive. Her victory became a rallying cry for others, proof that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged when the truth was undeniable. The case resonated far beyond Brookhaven. National conversations reignited around race, authority, and accountability in policing. Universities studied the trial, activists cited it in rallies, and lawmakers pointed to it as a reason for reform. For Naomi Carter, life slowly returned to routine, though never what it once was. That morning on the roadside had changed her forever, but it had also changed her city, leaving behind a legacy carved not from fear, but from resilience and the pursuit of justice.